Behind the legend of Dracula lies a darker, more calculated history than any horror film ever dared to show. A history not of monsters and fangs, but of a real 15th century ruler who used fear as a system of government, and who reserved some of his cruelest punishments for women. This is the story of what Vlad III, Vlad the Impaler, is said to have done to women under his rule, captives, accused wives, and ordinary villagers, and why historians still argue over how much of it is fact, and how much is fear turned into legend. Vlad ruled Wallachia, a small principality in what is now Romania, during one of the most violent periods in Eastern European history, squeezed between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the kingdoms of Christian Europe, and he built his reputation not just on the battlefield, but through public, theatrical punishment designed to be seen, remembered, and feared. Chronicles from his own era, and shortly after, describe a ruler obsessed with order. Not just political order, but moral order, and it was in this obsession with morality that women most often became his targets. According to several historical accounts, written by both German-speaking Saxon merchants who despised him and by later chroniclers who documented Wallachian customs, Vlad held women to an extreme standard of chastity and honesty, and those who were found to have broken that standard, through infidelity, premarital loss of virginity, or even simple laziness in their household duties, could face punishment far beyond anything considered normal justice, even in an age when public torture was common across Europe. One frequently cited account describes the fate of a woman accused of adultery. She was said to have been mutilated, her body publicly displayed as a warning, with the punishment carried out in the town square, so that every resident would understand what awaited anyone who broke Vlad's moral code. Other accounts describe unmarried women who had lost their virginity, and widows accused of being unchaste, facing similarly brutal treatment, often through impalement, the very method that gave Vlad his infamous name. A slow, agonizing death by a sharpened stake, a punishment he applied not only to enemy soldiers and political rivals, but, according to these accounts, to women judged guilty of moral failure. There is also a widely repeated story, found in several chronicles, of a peasant woman executed simply for weaving her husband a shirt that was too short, a punishment so disproportionate to the offense that many historians now believe it reflects exaggeration or outright invention rather than a literal historical event. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple tale of sadism, because much of what we know about Vlad's treatment of women comes from sources with a clear motive to make him look monstrous. The Saxon merchants of Transylvania, who had bitter trade disputes and military conflicts with Vlad, began circulating pamphlets about him almost immediately after his reign, describing acts of extraordinary cruelty in vivid, almost gleeful detail, and thanks to the newly invented printing press, these pamphlets spread across German-speaking Europe faster than almost any written material before them, making Vlad, in effect, the subject of one of history's earliest viral smear campaigns. Ottoman chroniclers, too, had every reason to exaggerate the brutality of a man who had humiliated Sultan Mehmed II's army and resisted Ottoman expansion for years, so their accounts, too, must be read with caution. This doesn't mean Vlad was innocent. Multiple independent sources, including neutral or even sympathetic Wallachian and Hungarian records, agree that he used impalement extensively, and that his justice was brutal by any standard, even for his time, but it does mean that specific gruesome stories about individual women may have been amplified, invented, or borrowed from folklore to make a political point, both by his enemies who wanted to destroy his reputation, and centuries later by writers and storytellers who wanted a more sensational Dracula. What made Vlad's cruelty toward women particularly calculated, according to historians who study his reign, was its public and symbolic nature. He was not simply punishing individuals, he was sending a message to an entire society still recovering from decades of civil war, foreign invasion, and collapsing authority, and using the female body, reproduction, marriage, and household honor, as a battleground for reasserting control over Wallachian society. In a world where a ruler's legitimacy depended on projecting absolute power, punishing moral corruption, in women was also a way of demonstrating that no one, not nobles, not merchants, not peasants, and not their wives and daughters, stood outside his authority. Some historians argue that Vlad's obsession with sexual virtue may also connect to his own turbulent personal history. Years spent as a hostage in the Ottoman court as a boy, a childhood marked by captivity, uncertainty, and the constant threat of violence. Though this remains speculation rather than established fact, since we have no direct testimony from Vlad himself explaining his motives. What is clear is that stories of his cruelty toward women became especially useful to his enemies precisely because they were so shocking. Violence against women, even in a brutal age, carried a unique power to horrify audiences across Europe, and this made such stories the perfect propaganda weapon, spread deliberately to paint Vlad not just as a harsh ruler, but as something inhuman. This is also the raw material that, centuries later, fed directly into the vampire legend. The idea of Dracula as a predator who specifically targeted women, seen in nearly every film and novel from Bram Stoker onward, did not come from nowhere. It is a distorted echo of these very stories, transformed from historical atrocity propaganda into gothic horror fantasy, with the political villain of the 15th century reborn as the supernatural villain of the 19th. So when we ask what the real Dracula did to captive and accused women, the honest answer is layered. There is likely a foundation of real, brutal punishment rooted in an extreme code of enforced morality and public terror. There is a substantial layer of wartime and political propaganda designed to make that brutality seem even more extreme and more personal than it may have been. And there is centuries of storytelling that took both the truth and the exaggeration and turned it into legend. Untangling exactly where the man ends and the myth begins may be impossible at this distance in history, but what remains undeniable is this: whether through calculated cruelty, propaganda, or both, Vlad the Impaler built a reign remembered as much for its violence against the vulnerable as for its battles against empires. And it is that unresolved tension between historical fact and manufactured horror that keeps the real Dracula more disturbing and more fascinating than any fictional vampire could ever be. If you like this history documentary, please subscribe, and thanks for watching.